Crimea was sold to the world as Russia's unsinkable aircraft carrier, a fortress that would dominate the Black Sea forever. However, there is a problem, and Russia now is starting to realize it. And that's when you have a fortress that lacks supply lines, or supply lines that are often attacked, you actually don't have a fortress. You have a target, a sitting duck in the middle of the Black Sea. The Kremlin had promised everyone that it would achieve total control of Crimea with no risk. It would have permanence at no cost. But permanence collapses the very moment that you lack food and fuel. And now, instead of a single decisive battle, we are watching a slow-motion symphony of systemic collapse. The foundations of Russia's occupation of Crimea are shaking as its very ability to defend it are being shattered. My name is Jason Smart here in Kyiv, Ukraine. And when we examine what's going on, when we look at this failure chain, link by link, we see very clear, repeatable patterns. The cut lines, the blind sensors, the drain of fuel. What Russia had once claimed was its, quote, greatest strategic asset is now its most profound vulnerability. And there's four big things working against Russia now. The bridge, the fleet, air, and the logistics. And once you see how each of these pillars collapses under pressure, you'll understand very easily why the fortress is beginning to choke from within. So let's look at this. Let's look at these four factors: the bridge, the fleet, air, and logistics. To understand how the fortress is cracking, though, let's first understand how we got to this point. How did Russia get here? So in March 2014, you recall, unmarked Russian troops entered Simferopol. They immediately rushed through a referendum, and of course, they claimed 97% support. Let's be clear, though, that coercion dressed as consent is still coercion. However, Moscow poured in billions of dollars to build new barracks, runways, fighter patrols, and in 2018, they finally opened their big bridge, the Kerch Bridge. Now, the Kerch Bridge itself is a massive engineering feat, and it was designed to make Russia's temporary stay in Crimea look permanent. But at this point, there's something else going on. Though it has some of the most dense fortifications of any point in the world, it in fact is sort of a Potemkin fort. Because though it has very hard surfaces, it has a very soft understructure. And now, under stress, we see that it is failing. Russia, of course, claimed that it had to enter into Crimea and take it over illegally against all the international treaties that Russia had signed, saying that it would protect Ukraine's sovereignty. Russia says that there was a historical precedent, that this was always Russian history. But let's be clear, this is not what motivated Russia, because this is clear-cut propaganda. History, in fact, exposes the lie. Crimea historically was not part of Russia. That started in 1783. But before its annexation, it had never been part of Russia. And during the Soviet period, in 1954, Crimea was officially transferred by decree to Ukraine. And in fact, it was part of Ukraine when in 1991, it voted, like the rest of the majority of Ukraine, to secede from the Soviet Union. That is, the majority of people in Crimea said we want to be part of independent Ukraine, no longer in the Soviet Union with Russia. So Russia, though, claims that for 2 centuries it controlled Crimea, and hence it has some sort of an eternal right to control it. But Crimea's identity had plenty of other folks before the Russians showed up. Most importantly, the Tatars. The Tatars are sadly the group that routinely get attacked by the Russians. Routinely, the Russians have tried to wipe them out. In May 1944, Stalin famously deported the entire Tatar population. He sent them all to Central Asia. This is ethnic cleansing, and that's very common for regimes, that they simply cannot erase the claims of these groups, so they seek to erase them as a people instead. But despite these bans, despite these hardships, over 250,000 Tatars returned from Central Asia to their ancestral homeland in the 1980s. And very quickly, they rebuilt their communities, they established a representative body for their own governance called the Majlis, and in 2016, no surprise, the Russians outlawed this legislative body. Now, this was condemned internationally, But of course, the Russians don't care. The Russians want control. So there's no historical factor here that would support Russia's argument that this has always been their territory. There was people before Russia, and Russia committed crimes to get them out. But today, Russia tries to make other arguments as to why it wants to keep this, that they spoke Russian language. There's no reason to think that Vladimir Putin, who does not care about the Russian-speaking people in his own country, cares about the Russian-speaking people of Crimea, and that was his priority. There's something much more clear and much more obvious as to why Moscow wants Crimea. Geography. That is the true reason that Moscow clings to Crimea. So remember, Sevastopol, the deep water ports there, that has been the fleet hub of the Russian Black Sea Fleet going back to the 18th century. But it also is very important because they enable strikes on Ukraine's ports. They also provide a launch pad into the Mediterranean. So Russia needs these deep ports. It doesn't have a lot of other options. It needs it so its big ships can be serviced, armed, and ready to go. But to reach the Mediterranean, there's another factor here, and one of the countries that is helping Ukraine, which is that to reach the Mediterranean, there is a very powerful and important gatekeeper, Turkey. And when Turkey decides it wants to close off the straits, your blue water fleet becomes a lake fleet. Now, keep in mind, Turkey has controlled the Bosphorus as well as Dardanelles since the 1936 Montreux Convention. That's very important, and it's something that Turkey takes seriously. Back in 2022, they closed the straits to Russian warships. So this doesn't make Russia very happy, but it still wants Crimea, hoping that one day it'll be able to cut a deal. But Turkey is not keen to see Russia dominate the Black Sea, which is why Ankara would prefer to see Crimea under Ukraine and not under Moscow. So today, what we see going on is that Russia is holding onto Crimea, depending almost entirely on physical connection. The Kerch Bridge is what they got. They don't have a ton of other options. However, even the Kerch Bridge, do they really have full control of it? You remember back in October 2022, when an explosion dropped a span into the strait? I recall that day as well. Do you remember July 2023? Sea drones began to chew up the piers. Or in June 2025, when the underwater blast used over 1,000 kilograms, or 2,400 pounds, of explosives against the bridge's supports. The bridge still stands, but its purpose as a reliable military artery has been broken. Simply, it can't be trusted at this point. And that's a very good thing, because right now, there's something else that cannot be trusted. The fleet. Because the Black Sea Fleet that was meant to be projecting power, it's been hiding from the Ukrainians for months. It's a hidden fleet. It's a hidden fleet that does not control the coastline. We recall what happened to the flagship Moskva, and there's plenty of other ships that went down like it to the seabed. So Russia can't count on its fleet to protect it, so it has to count on other things. It has to count on its ability to continue occupying this territory using everything it has. So we look at the air defense umbrella as an example thereof. It once seemed impossible to attack Crimea. There was simply so much air defense. But every day we see Ukraine is taking out more attacks, striking more and more within Crimea. And these holes are putting holes in the shield, and it just invites more fresh strikes. Ukraine has been routinely striking S-400s, S-300s, radars, launchers. So even Russia's most advanced systems are being peeled away. Its ability to protect Crimea is being destroyed. And we've seen just in the past few months how it goes after one system after the other. And the Russians don't have replacements. It's not like they have tons of different systems they can bring in there. As we've discussed before, Russia needs to bring more of its air defense back to mainland Russia to protect it. Because right now, the Ukrainians are destroying the oil industry. They are destroying across Russia the ability to have peace as airports are closed for days. This is changing the dynamic of the war. This is changing how Russia thinks of Crimea and if it can afford to continue supplying it. And it's going to be harder and harder for the Russians. We saw this month. Look at in the city of Tokmak. Ukraine struck the fuel trains there, and Ukraine has routinely continued to attack both the radar, the launchers, as well as the fuel going to Crimea. So As a whole across Russia, just the same in Crimea, we see that the Russian military gets a priority. They get the priority of fuel, for instance, which means that for the civilian population, it's gotten really expensive in Crimea to buy fuel, and the lines are getting out of control. But the Russians are worried about this for a different reason. They're worried about this not because they care if their local population is suffering. That's never a priority. What they are concerned by, though, is the fact that within Crimea, it's not as homogeneous and happy as the Russians would like you to believe. In fact, those who give the information, the coordinates to the Ukrainians to do the attacks within Crimea, they are underground Tatar networks. They are actively working against the Russian occupation. They're actively doing their part to help end the occupation. So going ahead, there's a few different things that could happen, and it's very unclear exactly which one of them would be. But without any doubt, the Russians had always counted on the idea that they would have the Kerch Bridge. They would have secure sea access. But today, both are in question. And if you lose one, the garrison will struggle, undoubtedly. But imagine if you lose both. Your garrison will starve. And today, both are catastrophically compromised. The bridge is unreliable. The fleet is in hiding. Ukraine's method is working. It's been systematically cutting the lines, blinding the sensors, and draining the fuel. And it's repeating this until it all fails. And at this point, it looks like it's getting closer and closer. Because one day, I'm sure we are all expecting it and very hopefully looking forward to it, that bridge will get struck. And at that point, the Russians don't have a plan B. And at that point, Crimea's future, being occupied by Russia, might come to a very rapid end. The best part, though, the clock is already ticking. Thank you for watching. Please like this video. Please subscribe. Leave your comments below. Do you think that Crimea's liberation is near? Will we soon get to experience a Crimean beach party? As always, thank you for supporting.